The moment Henry Reed saw the photograph, he dropped the package he was delivering. Because hanging on the wall of a billionaire CEO's office, framed in dark wood lit like a shrine, was a picture of his dead wife. Not a company portrait, not a stock image. It was personal. She was wearing the blue dress he'd bought her for their anniversary, the same smile she only gave when she was truly happy. A smile meant for him. He turned to the CEO and whispered, "Why do you have this?" She closed the door. "Because your wife wasn't who you think she was." Before we get into this one, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from today. And if you're not subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that button. Trust me, you're going to want to be here for what comes next. Henry Reed had 2 jobs every morning before the sun came up. The first was getting his 5-year-old son Elijah dressed, fed, and ready for kindergarten. The second was convincing himself that everything was going to be fine. Most days, he almost believed it. He'd set his alarm for 4:45, brew a pot of coffee he'd reheat 3 times before finishing, and lay out Elijah's clothes the night before, always one size too big, because the boy was growing faster than Henry's paycheck could keep up with. By 6:15, they'd be in the car. By 6:40, Elijah would be dropped off at Ms. Patterson's early care program. By 7, Henry would clock in at Reynolds Courier Services, load his van, and start his route. It was a simple life, small, predictable. And Henry held on to it the way a man holds onto a rope over a canyon, not because it was comfortable, but because letting go meant falling. 3 years. That's how long Naomi had been gone. 3 years since the hospital called at 2 in the morning. 3 years since he sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights while a doctor explained in words that sounded rehearsed that his wife's body had simply shut down. A rare complication, they said. Organ failure linked to an underlying condition no one had caught in time. Henry still wore his wedding ring, not on a chain around his neck like people suggested, on his finger, where it belonged. Some of the other drivers at work thought it was sad. His mother thought he needed to move on. Henry didn't care what any of them thought. The ring was the last promise he'd made to Naomi, and he wasn't the kind of man who broke promises. Elijah looked just like her. Same wide brown eyes, same quiet way of studying the world before deciding whether to trust it. The boy was sweet-natured and sharp, already reading on his own, already asking questions Henry didn't always know how to answer. But there was something else about Elijah that kept Henry up at night. Something he tried not to think about too hard. The fevers. They came without warning every few weeks, sometimes more. Elijah would be fine at breakfast, laughing at cartoons, and by afternoon his teacher would call to say he was lying on a cot in the nurse's office burning up. The doctors ran tests, blood work, more blood work. They used words like monitor and observe and follow up, but no one gave Henry a straight answer. The bills kept stacking. The answers kept not coming. And Henry kept driving his routes because standing still meant drowning. In the closet of their small apartment on the top shelf behind a box of winter blankets sat a cardboard box with Naomi's name written on the side in her handwriting. Henry hadn't opened it. Not once in 3 years. He told himself it was her teaching materials, old lesson plans, children's books, maybe some of the watercolor supplies she used for her classroom projects. He told himself he'd get to it eventually, but the truth was simpler and harder than that. He was afraid. Afraid that opening it would make her more gone than she already was. So the box stayed on the shelf, and Henry stayed on his route, and life continued in the small, fragile shape he'd built for it. Until Thursday. The delivery was routine. A sealed envelope marked Confidential Executive Office, headed to Whitmore Biotech, the gleaming 40-story tower downtown that Henry had driven past 100 times but never entered. He didn't know much about the company. Biotech, pharmaceuticals, the kind of place where people wore lanyards and talked about quarterly earnings. Not his world. He pulled into the loading bay, signed in at security, and took the elevator to the 38th floor. The lobby up there smelled like money-polished marble, fresh flowers, air that had been filtered through something expensive. A receptionist with a headset glanced up at him. Delivery for the executive office, Henry said, holding up the envelope. Ms. Whitmore's assistant is out today, the receptionist said, barely looking at him. You can take it directly to her office. End of the hall, last door on the left. Just leave it on the desk. Henry nodded and walked. His boots were quiet on the carpet. The hallway was lined with framed photographs, board members' award ceremonies, ribbon cuttings. He didn't look at them. He just wanted to drop the envelope and get back to his van before parking enforcement found a reason to ticket him. The office door was open. He stepped inside. It was the kind of room that made you feel small on purpose, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a desk the size of a dining table, bookshelves that looked like they'd been arranged by a designer rather than a reader. Henry set the envelope on the desk and turned to leave. Then he saw it. On the wall to the right of the window between a framed diploma and a crystal award hung a photograph. It was the size of a standard portrait, maybe 8 by 10 set in an elegant dark wood frame. And in that frame, smiling directly at the camera, was Naomi. His Naomi. She was wearing the blue dress, the cornflower blue wrap dress he'd bought her for their second anniversary, because she'd pointed it out in a store window and said it reminded her of the sky back home. Her hair was down the way she wore it on weekends. Her smile was the one she saved for moments when she was genuinely happy, not the polite one she used for strangers. Henry stopped breathing. His hand reached out involuntarily, then pulled back. He stared at the photograph the way a man stares at a ghost, not with fear, but with the desperate, illogical hope that it might be real. It wasn't a stock photo. It wasn't a company headshot. This was personal, intimate. Someone had chosen this image with care, framed it with intention, and placed it where they would see it every single day. He was still standing there, his entire body rigid, when a voice came from behind him. "You're the courier." Henry turned. A woman stood in the doorway, mid-60s, silver hair cut sharp at the jaw, a charcoal suit that probably cost more than his monthly rent. She carried herself with the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself, it just filled the room. Rachel Whitmore. Her eyes moved from Henry's face to the photograph on the wall, and something shifted in her expression. It wasn't surprise. It was recognition, as if she'd been staring at a clock for years, and it had finally struck the hour. Henry's voice came out broken, barely above a whisper. "That's my wife. That's Naomi. Why is her picture on your wall?" Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't offer a corporate smile or a convenient lie. She stepped into the office, closed the door behind her with a soft click, and walked to the small table near the window where a glass pitcher of water sat. She poured 2 glasses, set one on the edge of the desk closest to Henry, took a slow sip from her own. Then she looked at him, really looked at him, and said, "I didn't look for you. She made me promise I wouldn't. But I always knew this day would come." The room tilted. Henry gripped the back of the nearest chair to steady himself. "What are you talking about?" His voice was harder now, defensive. "How did you know my wife?" Rachel set her glass down. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, the mask of composure slipped just enough for Henry to see something underneath, something heavy, something old. "Sit down, Mr. Reed." "I don't want to sit down. I want to know why you have a picture of my dead wife in your office like she meant something to you." "She did mean something to me," Rachel said quietly. "She meant a great deal. And you deserve to know why, but not like this, not standing in a doorway with your fists clenched." Henry looked down. His fists were clenched. He hadn't noticed. Every instinct told him to leave, to walk out of this sterile tower and go back to his van, his route, his life. Whatever this woman had to say, it belonged to a world he didn't understand and hadn't asked to enter. He could feel the weight of the choice pressing down on him, the door behind him, the chair in front of him. He pulled the chair back and sat down. Not because he trusted Rachel Whitmore, not because he was ready for whatever she was about to say, but because Naomi's face was on that wall, and after 3 years of unanswered questions, he was tired of being the man who didn't ask. "Start talking," he said. Rachel didn't answer right away. She moved to the window, her back to Henry, and stared out at the city below as though she were deciding how much of the truth she could afford to give away. "Your wife worked here," she finally said. "Before she became a teacher. Before any of that, Naomi was a researcher at this company." Henry felt the words land somewhere deep in his chest, in a place he didn't know was still tender. He searched Rachel's profile for a lie, for any sign that this was some kind of mistake or manipulation. He found nothing but the rigid posture of a woman choosing every syllable with surgical care. "That's not possible," he said. "She was a teacher, elementary school, 3rd grade. She loved those kids." "She did become a teacher," Rachel said, still facing the window. "But that was her second life. Her first one was here in this building. She was a molecular biologist, brilliant, one of the sharpest minds we ever had on staff." Henry stared at the photograph on the wall, the blue dress, the smile. He'd looked at that face every day for years, kissed it, fought with it, built a life around it. And now a stranger was telling him it belonged to someone he'd never met. Why would she hide that from me? The question came out quieter than he intended, more vulnerable. He hated how it sounded. Rachel turned from the window. She wanted a clean break, a fresh start. The work here was intense. She burned out. It happens in this industry more than people admit. She walked away, reinvented herself, and found a new life. Rachel's gaze drifted to the photograph. "I think you were the best thing that ever happened to her." It was a clean story, neat, the kind of explanation that wrapped itself in a bow and asked you not to pull the ribbon. And for a moment, Henry almost accepted it. Burnout, a career change. People did that. It wasn't a betrayal, it was just a chapter she'd closed before he came along. But something didn't fit. He looked at the photograph again, at the frame, the placement, the care with which it had been positioned on that wall. This wasn't a company memorial. This wasn't a plaque honoring a former employee. This was personal. This was guilt. "You don't hang a picture of someone who just quit because they were tired," Henry said. His voice had changed, harder, steadier. "I've been doing deliveries for 6 years. Nobody frames my photo when I leave a route, so what are you not telling me?" Rachel's expression shifted. The polished composure cracked just slightly, like a hairline fracture in porcelain. Her lips pressed together. Her fingers gripped the edge of her desk. "That's all I can tell you, Mr. Reed." Her voice was controlled, but the effort was visible. "I've already said more than I should have. Your wife was a valued colleague, and I keep her photo as a reminder of the people who've contributed to this company. That's the truth." "No, it isn't," Henry said. "I need you to leave now." She said it like a woman used to being obeyed, like the sentence itself was a door closing. And maybe with anyone else it would have worked. But Henry had spent 3 years carrying questions he couldn't ask, and now that someone finally had answers, he wasn't going to walk away because a CEO told him to. He stood up, but he didn't move toward the door. He looked at Rachel, really looked at her and saw it. The tightness around her eyes. The way her hand had moved to the desk as if bracing against something. This wasn't a woman protecting company secrets. This was a woman afraid. "You're scared," Henry said. It wasn't a question. Rachel didn't respond. She pressed a button on her phone and spoke to the receptionist. "Please escort Mr. Reed to the lobby." Henry walked out. But not because she'd won, because he knew now with absolute certainty that the story she'd given him was only the surface, and if Rachel Whitmore wouldn't tell him the rest, he'd find it himself. The drive home took 40 minutes. Henry didn't turn on the radio. He didn't call anyone. He just drove, replaying every conversation he'd ever had with Naomi, searching for the seams he'd missed. Had there been signs, he thought about the way she'd stiffen sometimes when medical dramas came on television, not at the blood, but at the lab scenes. The way she'd deflect whenever he asked about her college years, turning the question into a joke or a kiss. The way she'd once picked up a journal from a bookstore, Something about genetic research flipped through it with the speed of someone who already knew the material, then put it back and said, "Just curious." He'd thought nothing of it. People had layers. Naomi had hers. He'd loved her without needing to excavate every one of them. But now the layers were cracking open on their own. When he got home, Elijah was already asleep. Henry's mother had picked him up from school. The apartment was quiet. Henry stood in the hallway for a long time, staring at the closet door. Then he opened it. He pulled down the cardboard box from the top shelf, the one with Naomi's handwriting on the side, the one he'd avoided for 3 years. He set it on the kitchen table, pulled back the flaps, and looked inside. It wasn't teaching materials. On top was an employee badge, Whitmore Biotech Research Division. The photo showed a younger Naomi, her hair cut short, wearing a white lab coat. She was smiling, but it was a different smile than the one he knew, more focused, more driven. The woman in this photo wasn't the gentle third-grade teacher who made watercolor planets with her students. She was a scientist. Beneath the badge was a small USB drive unlabeled, and beneath that, folded carefully in a plain white envelope, was a letter. Handwritten. Naomi's handwriting, he'd have recognized it anywhere, the way her letters leaned slightly to the right, the way she crossed her T's with long, confident strokes. The envelope was addressed in her hand, "For Henry when the time comes." His throat tightened. She'd written this for him, not as a goodbye because she couldn't have known when she would die, but as a contingency, a fail-safe. She'd known that someday, somehow, her past would reach him, and she'd prepared for it. He unfolded the letter. It was short, barely half a page. "If you're reading this, it means someone has told you about my past. I'm sorry I never told you myself. I wanted to so many times. But every time I tried, I looked at you and Elijah and couldn't bear to bring that world into ours. Everything I did for Elijah. One day you'll understand. Please don't hate me." Henry read it 3 times. Each time the same line hit him like a fist. Everything I did for Elijah. Not for herself, not for the company, for their son. The son who was asleep in the next room, the son who ran fevers that doctors couldn't explain, the son she'd been protecting from something Henry still couldn't see. He folded the letter, put it in his jacket pocket, and sat at the kitchen table until the sky turned gray with early morning light. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. The woman he'd married had lived an entire life before him, and the only clue she'd left behind was a letter that raised more questions than it answered. By 8 the next morning, Henry was back at Whitmore Biotech. He walked through the front entrance and held up his courier badge to the security desk, same company, same uniform. The guard waved him through without a second glance, but Henry didn't head for the loading bay. He walked past the receptionist who recognized him and reached for her phone and straight to Rachel Whitmore's office. The door was closed. He opened it without knocking. Rachel was seated at her desk reading glasses on a stack of documents in front of her. She looked up and the color drained from her face. Henry pulled the letter from his jacket and set it on her desk right on top of her documents. "She left me this," he said. "She said everything she did was for our son. So now you're going to tell me what she did. All of it." Rachel looked at the letter. Her hand moved toward it, then pulled back as though the paper might burn her. She took off her reading glasses and set them down slowly. When she finally looked up at Henry, the mask was gone. No CEO, no corporate armor, just a woman staring at a debt she'd been carrying for years. "Close the door," she said. Henry closed it. "Sit down." He did. Not because she asked, but because his legs were shaking, and he didn't want her to see. Rachel picked up the letter. She read it, and her eyes glistened but held steady. When she set it down, she pressed her fingers flat against the desk, as though anchoring herself to something solid. "Naomi wasn't just a researcher here," Rachel said. "She was the lead scientist on a project called Meridian. It was a gene therapy program, one of the most ambitious in the company's history." We're talking about a treatment that could have revolutionized how we approach inherited blood disorders. The potential was worth billions. Naomi was the one driving it. Henry listened. He didn't interrupt. He let Rachel speak because he could see how much it cost her to form each sentence. About 6 years ago, Naomi found a problem. A serious flaw in the clinical trial protocols, the kind of flaw that could put patients at risk. Contaminated sample handling, unreliable control data. She flagged it internally, and when the project board dismissed her concerns, she threatened to go public. She was going to blow the whistle. Rachel's voice thinned. She stood up and walked to the window again, but this time it wasn't to hide. It was to keep herself together. At the time, I wasn't CEO. I was the Senior Vice President of Research and Development. Naomi reported directly to me. She came to my office, sat in that same chair you're in now, and told me she was going to the FDA. She showed me the data, and I knew she was right. Henry felt the room contract around him. So what did you do? Rachel didn't turn around. I had a choice. I could support her back, her findings go to the board, and blow up the biggest project this company had ever undertaken. It would have cost thousands of jobs. It would have destroyed the stock price, and it would have ended my career. She finally turned to face him, and Henry saw something he hadn't expected: shame. Not the performative kind, the kind that lives in the bone. I chose the company. I went to our legal team and proposed a settlement, a confidentiality agreement. We would address the flaws internally quietly on our own timeline. And in exchange, Naomi would resign, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and walk away. Henry's jaw tightened. The words came out low and even, but the anger behind them was enormous. So you silenced her? Yes, Rachel held his gaze. I silenced her, and I've lived with that every single day since. Henry pushed back from the desk. He could feel the rage building, not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold kind, the kind that sharpens everything. He thought about Naomi in that same chair alone, facing this woman and an army of corporate lawyers. He thought about the courage it must have taken to stand up, and the betrayal when nobody stood with her. I'm done, Henry said, standing. I'm going to the press. I'm going to every news outlet that'll listen. You think you can buy silence and frame it as a favor? My wife deserved better than that. He was at the door when Rachel spoke again. Before you go, ask yourself why she signed. Henry stopped. His hand was on the door handle. He didn't turn around. Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper. I offered her the settlement, Henry, but I didn't set the terms. She did. He turned around slowly. Rachel was standing behind her desk, both hands flat on the surface, as though holding herself upright. Naomi agreed to the NDA. She agreed to leave the company to erase her name from every project she'd ever touched. She gave up her career, her reputation, her entire professional identity. But she didn't do it because we pressured her. She did it because she wanted something in return, one thing, and she wouldn't sign until she got it. Henry walked back into the room but didn't sit down. What did she want? A fund, Rachel said. An anonymous, permanently endowed medical fund specifically for the research and treatment of severe thalassemia, a rare inherited blood disorder. She demanded that Whitmore Biotech establish and fund it in perpetuity. No budget cuts, no expiration, no strings. The word hit Henry before the meaning did. Thalassemia. He'd heard it once in the corner of a waiting room when a nurse was explaining blood test results to another family. He'd heard fragments, chronic anemia, lifelong transfusions, genetic. He hadn't been listening closely. It hadn't been about his family, or so he'd thought. Naomi discovered the flaw in Meridian because she was deep in research on inherited blood disorders, Rachel continued. Her voice had gone flat clinical, as though the only way to say what came next was to strip it of all feeling. And during that research, she ran genetic screens, including on herself. That's when she found out she carried the gene. She knew what it meant. She understood the science better than almost anyone. She knew that any child she had would be at serious risk for thalassemia major, the severe form, the kind that requires lifelong treatment, transfusions, specialists, medication that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. Henry's chest locked. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. When she negotiated the NDA, Elijah hadn't been born yet, Rachel said. But Naomi knew he would be. She saw what was coming, not just for herself, but for the family she was going to build. So she used the only leverage she had. She traded her silence, her career, her entire identity for a fund that would cover every treatment her future child would ever need. The room swam. Henry gripped the back of the chair. He'd been sitting in the same chair where Naomi had once sat, and bargained for a child who didn't even exist yet. She used it, Henry said, and his voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. She used the whistleblower threat as leverage. She didn't use it to destroy the company, Rachel said. She used it to save her child. Every treatment, every transfusion, every specialist, paid for by a fund that Whitmore Biotech is legally obligated to maintain. Henry felt his legs give. He sank into the chair. Your son's medical bills, Rachel added quietly. The ones that seemed lower than they should have been. The insurance that covered more than you expected. That anonymous patient assistance program the hospital enrolled him in last year. That was the fund. It's been active since before Elijah was born. Naomi made sure of that. Henry thought about the letters he'd received from the hospital, the ones that said a portion of Elijah's care had been covered by a charitable program. He'd assumed it was some government assistance he'd qualified for. He'd been grateful without ever knowing who to thank. Now he knew. There's one more thing, Rachel said, and now her voice broke for the first time. Naomi carried the gene herself. She wasn't just a carrier, she had a milder form of the condition. She knew she was at risk for complications. The organ failure that killed her, it was connected. She could have redirected the fund to cover her own treatment. She could have demanded monitoring for herself, but she didn't. Every dollar, every resource, every provision in that agreement was for Elijah. She left nothing for herself. Henry looked down at his hands, at the wedding ring on his finger. 3 years he'd worn it, thinking it was a symbol of grief, thinking he was holding on to the memory of a woman he'd lost. Now he understood. Naomi hadn't just died. She'd spent the last years of her life carrying a secret that would have crushed most people, carrying it alone in silence so that Henry could be a father without fear and Elijah could have a future she'd paid for with everything she had. The letter in his jacket suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. Everything I did for Elijah. Not a confession, a testament. Henry sat in that chair for a long time. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just let the truth settle into him, heavy and irreversible, rearranging everything he thought he knew about his wife, his life, and the quiet woman who had loved them both from behind a wall of silence. Henry drove home with the windows down, even though the evening air was cold enough to sting. He needed the sharpness. He needed something real against his skin to remind him that this wasn't a dream, that the last 2 days had actually happened, and that the woman he'd loved and buried and mourned for 3 years had been someone far larger than the life he'd known. The apartment was quiet when he walked in. His mother had left a plate of food covered in foil on the counter and a note that said Elijah had been fussy after dinner, but fell asleep around 7:30. Henry set the note down and walked to his son's bedroom. Elijah was curled on his side, one arm around a stuffed elephant that Naomi had bought him the week he was born. His breathing was soft. His forehead, when Henry pressed the back of his hand against it, was warm, not burning, but warm enough to notice, always warm enough to notice. Henry sank into the chair beside the bed, the old wooden chair he'd pulled from the kitchen years ago so he could sit with Elijah during the bad nights, the fever nights, the nights when the boy would wake up crying and Henry would hold him and whisper that everything was going to be okay, even when he didn't know if that was true. He looked at his son's face, Naomi's face. The wide brown eyes were closed now, but Henry could see them perfectly. In his memory, could see the way they'd light up when Henry came home from work, the way they'd go glassy and distant when the sickness hit, the way they'd search his face for reassurance that Henry always gave and never fully felt. Now, every piece fell into place. The mysterious fevers, the blood draws that never led to a diagnosis, the hospital bills that should have been crushing but somehow weren't. Naomi had known from the very beginning what was wrong with their son, had known even before he was born. She'd known the name of the disease, the trajectory, the cost. And instead of telling Henry, instead of sharing the weight, she had walked into a room full of lawyers and executives and traded her entire identity for a fund that would keep Elijah alive. Henry wanted to be angry. Part of him was. She'd made a choice that affected both of them, a choice about their son's life, and she'd made it alone. She'd decided that Henry couldn't handle the truth, or that the truth would break him, or that it was simpler to carry it herself. And maybe she'd been right. Maybe he would have fallen apart. Maybe he would have done something reckless, gone to the press himself, burned down Whitmore Biotech without thinking about the consequences. Maybe she knew him better than he knew himself, but knowing that didn't make it hurt less. He sat in that chair until the apartment went dark around him, until the only light came from the glow of the street lamp outside Elijah's window. And somewhere in those hours between the anger and the grief and the overwhelming weight of love, Henry made his decision. He wasn't going to destroy what Naomi had built, but he wasn't going to let it stay hidden either. The next morning, Henry walked into Whitmore Biotech for the third time. The receptionist didn't try to stop him. She just picked up the phone, spoke quietly, and nodded toward the hallway. Rachel was expecting him. Her office looked the same. The photograph was still on the wall. The city still sprawled beyond the windows. But something about Rachel was different. She looked tired in a way that makeup couldn't fix, the kind of tired that comes from spending a night with your conscience and losing the argument. Henry didn't sit down. He stood across from her desk and spoke clearly. "I'm not going to the press," he said, "and I'm not going to sue you. Not because you don't deserve it, but because Naomi made a decision and I'm going to respect it." Rachel's shoulders dropped slightly. Not with relief, with something closer to gratitude that she didn't feel she'd earned. "But I have conditions," Henry continued, "and they're not negotiable." Rachel folded her hands on the desk. "I'm listening." "First, you fix what's broken. The research protocols, the trial oversight, whatever it was that Naomi found wrong 6 years ago. I don't care if it's already been patched up quietly. You do it publicly. You bring in outside auditors. You put systems in place so that no researcher in this building ever has to choose between doing the right thing and losing everything. Naomi shouldn't have been the only person in this company willing to stand up. You make sure she's the last person who has to stand alone." Rachel nodded slowly. "That's reasonable and overdue." "Second, the fund. It's not anonymous anymore. You take it public. Full transparency. Open it up so that other families who don't have a dead scientist bargaining for them can benefit too. Every kid with this disease deserves what Elijah has, not just my son." Rachel's jaw tightened, but she didn't object. Henry could see her calculating the exposure, the legal implications, the board meetings that would follow. But she didn't say no. "And third," Henry's voice dropped. This was the one that mattered most, and he could feel it in his throat before the words came out. "The fund carries her name, Naomi Reed, not as a victim, not as a whistleblower, as the founder, because that's what she was. She built that fund with everything she had, and the least you can do is make sure the world knows it." The office was still. The city hummed far below. Rachel looked at Henry, at the courier in work boots standing across from her mahogany desk, and whatever she saw in his face, it was enough. "She chose the right man," Rachel said quietly. Henry didn't respond to that. It wasn't Rachel's place to judge, and it wasn't the kind of compliment he needed. He just waited. "I'll do it," Rachel said. "All three. You have my word." "I don't want your word," Henry said. I want it in writing, and I want it done before the end of the quarter." Rachel almost smiled. It was the faintest thing, barely a movement at the corner of her mouth, but it was there. She reached for a pen. Henry turned toward the door, then stopped. He looked at the photograph on the wall one last time. Naomi in the blue dress. The smile that had belonged to him, and also, it turned out, to a life he'd never known about. He'd spent 3 years memorizing every detail of that face, trying to keep it alive in his mind. Now he realized he'd only ever known half of it. But it was enough. It was more than enough. "Do you want to take it?" Rachel asked, following his gaze to the photograph. "It belongs with you more than it belongs here." Henry shook his head. "Keep it. She earned her place on that wall." He walked out of the office, down the hallway lined with corporate portraits, past the receptionist, into the elevator, and through the marble lobby. When he pushed through the front doors, the afternoon sun hit him full in the face, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the warmth settle into his skin. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. The screen showed a call from Westfield Elementary. His chest tightened the way it always did when that number appeared, the automatic spike of fear that had become so familiar he barely recognized it anymore. He answered. "Mr. Reed, this is the nurse at Westfield. Elijah's running a fever again. It's low grade, but we'd like you to come pick him up when you can." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Henry said. He hung up and got in his van. The engine turned over on the second try the way it always did. He pulled into traffic, merged onto the main road, and headed toward his son's school. The fever would be there when he arrived. The blood work would come next. Then the specialists, the appointments, the conversations that used to terrify him because he didn't understand what was happening to his boy. But now he did. He understood everything. The disease, the fun, the woman who had seen it all coming and built a bridge across it before anyone else even knew there was a river to cross. Henry glanced at his left hand on the steering wheel. The wedding ring caught the light. He'd worn it for 3 years as a memorial, a way of holding on to something that was gone. He understood now that it had never been about holding on. It was about being held. Naomi had reached across time, across silence, across death itself, and wrapped her hands around the 2 people she loved most in the world. She'd done it without recognition, without gratitude, without ever hearing Henry say the words he wished he could say to her now. He couldn't say them. She was gone, and no amount of truth could bring her back. But he could do the next best thing. He could raise their son. He could make sure Elijah grew up knowing that his mother wasn't just a kind woman who taught 3rd grade and painted watercolor planets. She was a scientist who changed the rules, a mother who traded everything for his future, a woman who carried the hardest secret a person can carry and carried it alone, not because she had to, but because she loved too much to let anyone else share the weight. Henry pulled into the school parking lot. Through the window, he could see Elijah sitting in the nurse's office, his small legs dangling off the cot, his stuffed elephant tucked under one arm. The boy looked up and saw the van, and even through the glass, Henry could see the relief spread across his son's face. He turned off the engine, took a breath, and walked inside to get his boy. Because that's what Naomi would have done. That's what she did do every single day of her life in ways Henry was only now beginning to understand. And sometimes the most shocking truth isn't betrayal. It's discovering that someone loved you and protected you far more than you ever knew. If this story hit you the way it hit me, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. And if you're not part of this community yet, subscribe and turn on notifications, because stories like this one, they're just the beginning.